Every generation, someone told black families to stop cooking collard greens. Nutritionists said the method was unhealthy. Food magazines ignored the dish for decades. School lunch programs swapped it out for frozen broccoli and canned corn. And still, right now, somewhere between Jackson and Atlanta, a grandmother is standing over a pot seasoned the exact same way her own grandmother seasoned it. Nothing changed. Not the smoked meat in the broth, not the vinegar on the table, not the hours it takes to do it right. What you are about to hear is one of the quietest acts of defiance in American food history. The moment the medical establishment tried to kill this dish might surprise you. The church suppers that refuse to let it go will stop you cold. And the story of how one cooking tradition crossed an ocean and fed a people for 4 centuries is something nobody teaches in school. Hit subscribe because this is the kind of history that disappears when no one says it out loud. Here's why black families never stopped cooking collard greens. Collard greens did not begin in Mississippi. They did not begin in Georgia, Alabama, or the Carolinas. The Brassica oleracea family, the group that includes collards, cabbage, and kale, is native to the coastlines of Europe and the Mediterranean basin. But in West Africa, leafy greens had been central to cooking for centuries before European contact. Communities simmered them in communal pots with smoked fish, ground peppers, and palm oil. The technique was always the same. Cook the greens low and slow in liquid until they soften. Never throw away the broth. The broth held the nutrition. It was the point. When enslaved Africans were forced onto ships bound for the Americas, they brought no possessions. What they brought was knowledge. How to read unfamiliar soil, how to identify plants that could be eaten, how to coax food from ground that nobody intended them to use. The collard plant they found growing in the American South was not identical to what they had cooked at home, but the technique for preparing it was. That recognition changed everything. The plant thrived in long summers, tolerated poor drainage, and produced broad, sturdy leaves that could take hours of cooking without losing their structure. On plantations across the South, enslaved families were expected to survive on rations. The slaveholder's household decided cornmeal, salt pork, maybe some molasses. It was never enough. The small garden plots some enslaved people were permitted to tend behind their quarters became something the system did not anticipate. They became the first black food systems on the continent. Collard greens anchored those systems because the plant had one quality no other crop in those rows could match. It was cut and come again. Pull the outer leaves and the center kept producing. A single collard plant, tended carefully, could feed a family across an entire growing season without replanting. In a world built on total dependence, a crop that kept giving on its own terms was a quiet act of self-sufficiency that no overseer thought to prohibit. The collard plant did not look valuable. It was not a cash crop. It did not produce grain or fruit that could be sold at market. It produced large, tough, bitter-looking leaves that needed hours of labor to become edible. To the slaveholder, it was not worth regulating. To the family that tended it, it was the difference between hunger and something close to enough. The pot of collard greens was never just greens. It was a complete nutritional system disguised as a side dish. The leaves themselves are dense with calcium, iron, and vitamins. But the cooking liquid, the potlikker, was where the real value concentrated. Every mineral that left the greens during hours of slow simmering collected in that broth. Families drank it straight, soaked cornbread in it, or fed it to children and the elderly when solid food was difficult to manage. Some households used the leftover potlikker as the base for the next day's meal. Nothing was discarded because nothing could be spared. The seasoning meat told its own story. Ham hocks, smoked neck bones, fat back, pig feet, pig ears. These were the cuts the slaveholders' kitchen threw away. The cured and smoked scraps that white households considered waste became the flavor engine of an entire cuisine. A single smoked ham hock dropped into a pot of water with a pile of collard greens produced something that tasted rich, deliberate, and deeply seasoned. It was not poverty food pretending to be something else. It was poverty food refined over generations until it needed no apology and no explanation. The cooking technique passed the same way every time, by standing next to someone who already knew. Strip the leaves from the tough center stem. Wash them 3 or 4 times in cold water because collards grow close to the ground and hold grit in every fold. Stack the leaves, roll them tight, and cut them into ribbons. Drop them into a pot of seasoned, simmering liquid. Cook them low and slow, checking once an hour until they go dark and silky and the kitchen fills with a smell that is part smoke, part earth, and entirely specific to a Black Southern household. That smell is not incidental. For millions of people, it is the first thing they remember about their grandmother's house before they remember her face or her voice or the color of the curtains in her living room. The smell came first. The smell is what stays. And for a child who walked into that kitchen on a Saturday afternoon in 1967 or 1983 or last week, the smell of collard greens simmering with smoked pork is not a food memory. It is the entire architecture of home compressed into a single breath drawn at the front door. Here is something worth understanding before the next chapter of this story. Collard greens did not survive 400 years because they taste good. Plenty of dishes taste good and vanish within a generation. Collard greens survived because they became inseparable from the identity of the people who cooked them. Every Black family that kept a pot on the stove was carrying forward something larger than a recipe. It was proof that the knowledge survived, that slavery had not erased it, that poverty had not worn it down, that moving to a city 1,000 miles from home had not diluted it. The greens were not a side dish. They were a declaration, not a loud one, not a written one, just a pot simmering low on a back burner that said, this family is still here, still whole, still feeding itself on its own terms. No government pamphlet, no nutrition study, and no food trend could ever take that away. The dish itself was almost secondary. What it carried could not be replaced by anything on a grocery store shelf. When the Civil War ended and 4 million enslaved people walked into freedom, the diet barely changed. Freedom did not come with farmland, livestock, or capital. It came with sharecropping contracts that kept Black families tied to the same soil under a different name. The cash crops in the field belonged to the landowner. The crops behind the cabin still belonged to the family. Collard greens kept growing in those backyard plots the same way they had for generations, quietly, cheaply, and with almost no help. Sharecropping families across Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia lived on razor margins. What the family ate came from what they could grow, catch, or preserve on their own. Collard greens were reliable in a way almost nothing else was. They grew through fall and deep into winter, long after other crops had finished. A hard frost actually improved their flavor by converting starches in the leaves into sugar. Families who had nothing else in December still had collard greens. In some parts of the Deep South, collard patches survived into February, producing new leaves even after ice had killed the okra, the tomatoes, and the last of the field peas. The cooking stayed constant: a large cast iron pot, a piece of smoked or salted pork, hours of slow simmering over a wood fire. In some households, the pot ran nearly continuously through the colder months, with fresh greens and water added as the old batch was eaten down. Potlikker was saved, reused, built upon. The economics demanded it and the culture reinforced it. A woman who could keep a pot of greens going through January had done something that no landlord and no sharecropping contract could claim credit for. She had fed her family from her own ground with her own hands, using knowledge that belonged to no one but her. During Reconstruction and the Jim Crow decades that followed, Black communities across the South built their own institutions: churches, schools, mutual aid societies, burial funds. Every one of those institutions was sustained in part by food that women cooked and served. Collard greens appeared at church fundraisers, school events, burial society gatherings, and every meeting where people came together to organize their own survival. The dish was not chosen because it was extraordinary. It was chosen because it was always available, always affordable, and every woman in the room already knew exactly how to make it. When a lodge needed to feed 40 people on short notice after a funeral, nobody debated the menu. Somebody brought the greens, somebody brought the cornbread, somebody brought the sweet tea. The system ran itself because every woman involved had been trained by the same tradition and needed no coordination beyond showing up. The Great Migration changed almost everything about Black life in America. Between roughly 1910 and 1970, 6 million African Americans left the rural South for cities in the North, Midwest, and West. They left Mississippi for Chicago, Alabama for Detroit, Georgia for New York, Louisiana for Los Angeles. They left behind cotton fields, unpaved roads, and white-only water fountains. They did not leave behind the food. Collard greens traveled north in suitcases, in bundles on train platforms, and most importantly, in the memory of every woman who had learned to cook them by watching her mother. The first thing many migrant families did in a new city apartment was locate a source for greens. In Chicago's Bronzeville neighborhood, in Harlem, in West Philadelphia, in Watts, small grocery stores and open-air markets stocked collard greens alongside the other essentials of Southern cooking. These were not specialty items. They were survival staples for a displaced population trying to build a new life in an unfamiliar city with the one thing that still felt like home. The kitchen itself changed. It got smaller. Wood stoves gave way to gas burners. The backyard garden disappeared, replaced by a windowsill pot if there was sunlight, or a weekly trip to the market if there was not. But the cooking did not change. A big pot, more greens than seemed reasonable for a small apartment, a piece of smoked pork, hours of patient simmering. The apartment filled with a smell that turned a two-room walk-up on the south side of Chicago into something that felt for a few hours like Mississippi or Alabama or wherever that family had come from. The Great Migration produced one of the most remarkable food preservation events in American history. An entire cuisine developed under slavery and refined under segregation was transplanted intact into a completely different environment and survived. Not in restaurants, not in published cookbooks, in kitchens, in the hands of women who had learned from their mothers and would teach their daughters and never wrote a single instruction down. Collard greens anchored that transplanted cuisine because they required no special equipment, no expensive ingredients, and no guidance beyond what a child could absorb by standing next to her grandmother for an afternoon. The northern cities did something else to collard greens. They turned them into a cultural identity marker. In the rural South, everyone ate greens, black and white, rich and poor. In Chicago and New York and Detroit, collard greens became specifically, unmistakably, proudly Black food. Cooking them was a way of declaring where you came from and who your people were, even if you had been born on the north side and never set foot in a cotton field. The dish carried the entire South forward, one kitchen at a time. If the home kitchen was where collard greens were cooked, The church was where they became sacred. Black churches across the South and the urban North were not just places of worship. They were community centers, mutual aid hubs, political organizing grounds, and the place where the best cooks in a congregation brought their finest work to be judged. Church suppers, homecoming dinners, repast meals after funerals, Easter celebrations, and Juneteenth gatherings all had one thing in common: a massive pot of collard greens somewhere near the center of the table, prepared by whoever in the congregation had earned the right to make them. These were not casual meals. A woman's reputation as a cook was tested publicly at that table, and collard greens were the most scrutinized dish on the spread. Everyone had an opinion. Too much vinegar, not enough smoke in the broth, leaves cut too thick, cooked too soft, not cooked long enough. The judgment was delivered with love, but it was delivered honestly. The church table served another function that rarely gets named. For elderly members living alone, for families going through a hard season, for anyone who had lost the person who used to do the cooking, the church supper was a guaranteed meal prepared by someone who knew what they were doing. Collard greens were always part of that guarantee. They were cheap to prepare in volume. They reheated without losing their character. They traveled in a covered pot to a sick neighbor's door without falling apart. And every person who sat down already knew exactly what they were going to taste, because the recipe had not changed in their lifetime or their mother's lifetime or their grandmother's lifetime. The woman who made the greens for a repast after a burial was not just providing food. She was telling the grieving family that the world still worked the way it was supposed to, that some things had not been taken from them. The sameness of that pot was not stagnation. It was an anchor. It was the one thing on the table that nobody had the authority to change, because nobody outside the kitchen had ever controlled it. Here is the part of this story that nobody in a government office ever understood. Every time the American mainstream attempted to improve the diet of Black families, it began by attacking the food those families had been perfecting for generations. Lard was replaced by vegetable shortening. Whole milk was replaced by skim. Smoked pork was declared a cardiovascular hazard. And collard greens, cooked the traditional way with ham hocks and fatbacks simmering for hours, were labeled unhealthy by a nutrition establishment that was simultaneously promoting margarine, processed cheese, and sugar-loaded cereal as better alternatives. The irony was staggering, but the real issue was never irony. It was disrespect. Nobody framed the request honestly. Nobody said, "This food kept your family alive through slavery and sharecropping and the Great Migration, and we are asking you to abandon it because of research published last year." The request came without acknowledgement. It came without history. It came from people who had never stood in the kitchen they were trying to change. And that is precisely why so many families heard the advice, looked at the pot on the stove, and kept doing exactly what they had always done. When someone asks you to stop cooking the food your grandmother made and they cannot even name your grandmother, the answer has always been the same. The health debate around traditional soul food cooking intensified in the second half of the 20th century. Heart disease and hypertension rates in Black communities were disproportionately high, and public health campaigns pointed directly at dietary fat, sodium, and the long-cooked pork-seasoned preparations that defined Southern Black cooking. Smoked meat, salt pork, and the practice of flavoring every vegetable with rendered animal fat were identified as contributing factors. The message from doctors, nutrition programs, and public service campaigns was blunt: stop cooking this way. For many Black families, especially those whose grandparents had navigated generations of outside interference in how they lived, the advice landed poorly. Not because it was entirely wrong. There are legitimate concerns about excess sodium and saturated fat in any diet, but because the advice arrived with no understanding of what it was asking people to give up. Collard greens cooked low and slow with smoked neck bones were not a bad habit. They were a tradition that had survived the Middle Passage, chattel slavery, sharecropping, the Great Migration, and decades of urban poverty. Telling a woman in Birmingham who had been cooking greens the same way for 50 years to boil them in plain water with no seasoning was not a health recommendation. It was an erasure request dressed as concern. Some families adapted. Smoked turkey legs replaced ham hocks in the pot. Olive oil took over where fatback had been. Garlic and onion carried the seasoning load instead of salt. The greens still simmered for hours, but the broth got lighter. Other families changed nothing at all. Their own grandparents had cooked this way and lived deep into their 80s and 90s. The evidence in their own kitchens contradicted the pamphlet. Then, the science caught up. Research into cruciferous vegetables and anti-inflammatory compounds confirmed what Black cooks had understood for centuries. Collard greens are among the most nutrient-dense foods on the planet, high in fiber, loaded with vitamins A, C, and K, rich in calcium and antioxidants. The slow cooking method that experts had criticized actually breaks down tough plant fiber and makes nutrients more available to the body. The Potlikker that health campaigns told people to discard turned out to be a concentrated source of the exact minerals the greens released during cooking. The establishment spent decades urging Black families to abandon one of the most beneficial vegetables in existence, while promoting processed alternatives that turned out to be far worse. The reversal came quietly. No public health agency issued an apology. No nutritionist acknowledged that generations of Black grandmothers had been right about their own food. The vindication arrived through food science papers and wellness columns that rebranded collard greens as a superfood without ever crediting the people who had been growing, cooking, and eating them for 400 years. Today, collard greens appear on restaurant menus that charge more for a single plate than a Southern grandmother would spend feeding her whole family for an evening. The community that kept the tradition alive has noticed. There is no tradition in Black American cooking more universal than the New Year's Day meal. Collard greens, black-eyed peas, cornbread, and some form of pork. The greens represent money and prosperity. The peas represent luck. The cornbread represents gold. The pork represents forward motion because a pig roots ahead, never behind. This is not folklore from a museum exhibit. This is what is happening today in households across the country, from rural Alabama to suburban Atlanta to apartment buildings in Brooklyn. The New Year's meal is the one meal that almost no Black family skips, regardless of income, geography, or generation. A 25-year-old in Los Angeles who has never been south of Bakersfield will still cook collard greens on January 1st because her mother made them and her grandmother made them before that. And the idea of starting a year without that pot on the stove feels like tempting something that should not be tempted. The tradition operates deeper than superstition. It is a ritual of continuity. The act of preparing this meal connects the present to every January 1st that came before it, reaching back to families that had almost nothing else to celebrate with. The preparation begins on New Year's Eve. In many Black households, the night before the new year means two things: counting down the clock and washing collard greens. The leaves are stripped, washed in cold water over and over until no grit remains, then stacked, rolled tight, and sliced into ribbons. The seasoning meat goes into the pot first, sometimes the night before, simmering overnight so the broth is deep and ready by morning. The greens go in on New Year's Day itself, early enough to be ready by the afternoon meal. The house fills with the same smell that every person in the family has known since a childhood. Nobody questions this tradition. Nobody substitutes kale or Swiss chard or whatever a magazine suggests. Nobody adds a twist. It is collard greens cooked the way they have always been cooked, with the same seasoning meat and the same patience every single year. And that unbroken repetition is, by itself, the clearest answer to the question this story asks. Black families never stop cooking collard greens because some things are simply not negotiable. One of the most remarkable things about collard greens is that the recipe was never written down by the people who perfected it. Cookbooks exist, certainly. Edna Lewis described collard greens with the precision of a poet in The Taste of Country Cooking. Jessica B. Harris traced their West African roots across decades of scholarship, but in the actual kitchens where collard greens have been made every week for generations, there is no recipe card pinned to the wall. There never was. The knowledge was transmitted by proximity. A daughter stood next to her mother and watched. She learned when the water was the right temperature by the way the surface moved. She learned how much salt pork to use by the size of the pot and the number of people coming to eat. She learned when the greens were done by their color, their smell, and how they gave when pressed with the back of a wooden spoon. None of this was measured. None of this was recorded. The system was the body. A handful of this, a pinch of that, enough liquid to cover and cook until it looks like what your mother made. This oral and physical transmission is one of the reasons the tradition has proven so resistant to disruption. A printed recipe can be lost, misinterpreted, or edited by someone who does not know the context. A technique absorbed over 15 years of standing in a kitchen cannot be edited. It lives in the hands, it lives in the judgment of the cook, and it produces results that are remarkably consistent across thousands of kitchens spanning multiple generations, because the standard was never a tablespoon or a temperature. The standard was a memory. Does this taste like home? If yes, it is right. If no, you already know what went wrong. That chain of transmission is still intact in many Black families today. Grandmothers still teach grandchildren by letting them stand close enough to watch. Mothers still correct daughters without opening a book. The pot remains the classroom. The curriculum has not been revised in 200 years, and no app, no cooking show, and no meal kit service has managed to replace the authority of a woman who says, "This is how your grandmother did it, and that is how you are going to do it too." The recipe is not in a book. The recipe is in a person. And as long as that person is still standing in the kitchen, the tradition does not need anything else to survive. Altum Sero. Collard greens appear on fine dining menus today in cities from New York to San Francisco. They are braised in white wine, paired with artisanal sausage, and arranged on small plates at prices that would cover a week of groceries in the kitchens where the dish was born. The American food world discovered collard greens sometime in the past 2 decades and treated them the way it treats every Black culinary tradition it encounters, as a novelty that needs to be elevated, refined, and credited to the chef who put it on a tasting menu. The pot in the grandmother's kitchen did not notice. It kept simmering, the same smoked meat, the same low heat, the same unhurried hours that have not changed since before anyone alive today was born. The audience for that pot is not a food critic or a wellness influencer. It is a family that shows up on a Sunday afternoon knowing exactly what the kitchen will smell like and wanting nothing different. Collard greens have no marketing budget. They have no celebrity endorsement that matters to the people who actually cook them. They have no trending hashtag that keeps the tradition moving. They do not need one. They endure because they are made by people who refuse to stop making them for reasons that do not fit into a trend piece or a dietary study. The reasons are older than any of that. They are about memory. They are about resistance, quiet and persistent and unbroken. They are about love expressed through labor, the labor of washing every leaf by hand, stripping every stem, standing over a stove for hours in a kitchen that was already too warm in August, because that is what your mother did and her mother before her, and you are not going to be the generation that lets it go. Walk into any grocery store in the American South today, and a bunch of collard greens still cost next to nothing. That has always been part of the story. This was never a food that required wealth to sustain. It required will, and will is the one thing Black families in America have never been short of. Collard greens crossed an ocean in the memory of people who were allowed to carry nothing else. They grew behind cabins on land that was never meant to feed the families who worked it. They simmered in cast iron pots through slavery and sharecropping and the Great Migration and every decade since. Doctors told Black families to stop. Food trends ignored them. Fine dining tried to claim them, and the pot kept going.
Corn pudding was a smooth, custard-like side dish that showcased the natural sweetness of fresh corn blended with milk, eggs, and butter. Kernels were often scraped straight from the cob, releasing their milky juices before being folded into a simple batter. Some cooks added a spoonful of sugar, while others preferred a more savory approach with salt, pepper, or a dusting of cheese. In African American homes, it was a centerpiece at Sunday dinners, church socials, and holiday feasts, pairing beautifully with roasted meats or fried chicken. Its gentle texture and warm flavor made it appealing to all ages. Prepared in large pans, it could feed many with ease, making it ideal for big families and community gatherings. As boxed mixes and quick side dishes replaced scratch-made recipes, it became rarer, but for those who knew it well, corn pudding remains a beloved reminder of generous tables and heartfelt cooking. Lends flair to potlucks and bake sales, filling kitchens with the warm perfume of brown sugar and butter. A buttery shortbread crust was pressed into a pan and baked until just firm before being topped with a gooey mixture of chopped pecans, cream, and dark brown sugar. As it baked again, the topping bubbled into a caramel-like layer that set into chewy sweetness with a hint of nutty crunch. Each square delivered the flavor of classic Southern pralines in an easy-to-share form, perfect for coffee hours and church gatherings. Children loved licking the sticky syrup from their fingers, while adults reached for second and third pieces without apology. In the 1970s, these bars offered a bridge between candy making and home baking, capturing the indulgent spirit of Louisiana without the need for a candy thermometer. Pecan praline bars proved that a little Southern magic and a handful of pecans could turn an ordinary afternoon into a festival of sweetness worth every bite. Butter pecan ice cream was the homemade reward for hot summer. Smoked catfish tails reveal the skill and resourcefulness that defined survival cooking on plantations near rivers and coastal waters. After commercial fishermen or estate kitchens took the prime fillets, the bony tails and smaller pieces were often left behind. Enslaved cooks cleaned these scraps carefully, rubbed them with salt or local spices, and smoked them over slow hickory fires. The result was a flavorful preserved fish that kept for days and could be stirred into stews, crumbled over grains, or eaten on its own with cornbread. Smoking techniques reflected West African traditions carried across the Atlantic, where preserving fish with wood smoke had long been a way to ensure protein during lean seasons. In later years, African American fish camps and Southern smokehouses continued this method, turning a food of necessity into a celebrated regional specialty. Modern smoked catfish dishes found in Mississippi and Louisiana restaurants still trace their flavor back to these early practices of careful preservation and culinary creativity born from scarcity. Sun-cured crawfish tails were a marshland treasure, preserved through sunlight and time. Inland from the coast, those who lived near swamps trapped small crawfish in baskets or woven nets, cooking them over low flames before removing the meat. The tails were spread out on wooden boards and dried in the sun until leathery, ready to last for months. Once rehydrated, they flavored soups, rice, or cornmeal porridge with the taste of the bayou. Each batch was an act of careful labor, salting, drying, guarding from insects, and each handful stored away meant another meal secured. The air around the drying racks smelled faintly of salt and smoke, and the rhythm of turning the tails became almost ritual. This food was both preservation and preparation, a promise against hunger's return. For people who could not rely on markets or steady provisions, this practice was independence made edible. Like fish jerky, it carried both salt and strength, a trace of the water that gave it life. Every preserved crawfish tail was a memory of resourcefulness, a morsel of the marsh turned into endurance, a symbol of self-reliance drawn straight from the earth's edge. Hog cracklin cornbread was a rich, rustic twist on classic cornbread, baked with golden, crispy pork cracklings scattered throughout the batter. These flavorful bits of pork skin, still clinging to pockets of fat, released bursts of smoky, salty flavor in every bite. The bread itself was made from stone-ground cornmeal mixed with eggs and tangy buttermilk for tenderness. Once a favorite in farming communities, it reflected a tradition where nothing from the hog was wasted. Cracklin cornbread was served with collard greens, beans, or hearty stews, soaking up the flavorful juices. Sometimes it stood alone, eaten warm with butter as a filling snack. Closely linked to hog killing season, it carried the spirit of family gatherings and resourceful cooking. As fewer households raised their own livestock and diets shifted, the tradition faded, but for those who remember, its bold, satisfying bite remains an unforgettable taste of a time when food told a story. Wild rice pudding combined indigenous grains with African-inspired preparation to create a dish both nourishing and subtly sweet. Wild rice grew naturally in shallow lakes and slow rivers, and enslaved families near these wetlands harvested the dark grains with paddles and baskets, drying them in the sun for year-round use. Cooked slowly in water until tender, the rice was stirred with a bit of sorghum syrup or honey if available, making a warm pudding that supplied protein and lasting energy. Its nutty flavor and satisfying texture turned a simple bowl into a special treat, especially when fresh fruit or spices could be added. This recipe carried forward after emancipation as African-American cooks continued to value wild rice for festive meals and family gatherings. Modern chefs still celebrate its earthy richness, but the story behind wild rice pudding honors the blend of native and African foodways that sustained people through scarcity and created a dessert that is at once humble and deeply rooted in the shared history of America's wetlands and kitchens. Red drink. Juneteenth punch flowed like a symbol of freedom and memory at community celebrations marking emancipation. Made from hibiscus petals or bright strawberries steeped into a deep crimson infusion, the drink stood for resilience and the blood of those who fought for liberation. Families would gather in churchyards and town squares, pouring the sweet, tangy liquid into simple cups while music and laughter filled the warm June air. Children chased each other between picnic tables as elders told the story of the first Juneteenth, reminding everyone of the hard-won joy behind the holiday. The punch often carried a gentle spice from cloves or ginger, offering a flavor both refreshing and layered, much like the history it honored. Preparing the drink was as important as drinking it, with women and men alike contributing fruit, sugar, and labor to the cause. Though some communities still keep the tradition alive, many younger generations have never tasted the vibrant red drink that once defined a day of remembrance and celebration. Field pea and okra succotash was a colorful summer dish that combined the nutty taste of fresh field peas with the silky texture of okra and the sweetness of corn. Cooked gently in butter or with a touch of bacon fat, it celebrated the harvest season, bringing together vegetables that grew abundantly in southern gardens. African-American cooks often prepared it for family meals and community gatherings, serving it as a side or a light main dish with cornbread. The blend of textures, from the tender peas to the soft okra, created a satisfying balance, while the corn added bursts of sweetness. This dish reflected a strong connection to the land and the value placed on fresh, seasonal produce. As farming and home gardening declined, The tradition of making succotash with truly fresh ingredients became rarer, turning it into a nostalgic reminder of summer tables and garden-to-plate cooking. Cattail shoots were a food of hunger seasons, gathered from marshy ponds and swamps when the crops ran out. The young shoots, pale and tender near the base, could be eaten raw or boiled, tasting faintly of cucumber and corn. They grew where others saw only weeds, a secret supply of nourishment hidden in plain sight. Harvesting them meant wading into mud and cold water, cutting each stalk by hand. Cooked with salt or mixed into cornmeal cakes, they offered fiber, minerals, and hope. The cattail was generous. It provided roots for flour, leaves for weaving, and shoots for eating. Its abundance made it a silent ally to those who had little else. In the face of hunger, these swamp plants became a lifeline, a reminder that survival often grows quietly at the edge of hardship. Salted fish cakes were savory, pan-fried patties made from rehydrated salted fish mixed with mashed potatoes, onions, and spices. This preservation method had strong ties to African American and Caribbean cooking, where salted cod or other preserved fish were traded and transformed into flavorful meals. The mixture was shaped into cakes and fried until crisp on the outside with a tender, flaky interior. Often served with hot sauce or mustard, they could be eaten at breakfast, lunch, or dinner. The salty richness of the fish blended perfectly with the mild potatoes, while onions added sweetness and texture. In communities far from the coast, salted fish was a pantry staple that lasted for months without refrigeration. Fish cakes were an economical way to stretch limited protein, creating a satisfying dish that combined coastal preservation traditions with southern comfort cooking, delivering big flavor from simple, enduring ingredients. Wild persimmon leather served as a natural energy bar long before packaged snacks existed. Fully ripe wild persimmons, soft and honey-sweet, were mashed into a smooth pulp and spread thinly on clean boards or large leaves. Left in the sun to dry or placed near the gentle heat of a hearth, the mixture became a chewy sheet that kept for weeks. This portable treat provided a quick source of calories for long days in the fields and could be tucked into cloth packets for later use. The technique echoed African and indigenous methods of drying fruit to preserve it for travel and winter storage. After emancipation, many rural families continued to make persimmon leather as an autumn tradition, and some Appalachian homesteads still practice it today. Its deep caramel flavor and long shelf life show how ingenuity and patience created foods that were both practical and delicious. Wild persimmon leather stands as a vivid link between past and present, proving that simple preservation can yield enduring taste and nourishment. Sorrel hibiscus tea brought a ruby glow to church socials and summer porch gatherings. Its tart floral flavor, steeped from dried hibiscus petals and sweetened with cane sugar, reflected Caribbean influences that African American families carried north and west during migrations. Grandmothers brewed the tea in large enamel pots, sometimes adding a hint of ginger or a squeeze of lime to brighten the taste. Children watched the deep red liquid swirl into pitchers, knowing it signaled a special occasion. Served chilled over cracked ice in simple glasses, sorrel tea cooled guests during humid evenings while hymns and laughter filled the air. The drink offered more than refreshment. It was a quiet connection to ancestors and homelands across the sea. Over time, soda and store-bought beverages replaced the careful steeping of petals and spices, and the vibrant tradition faded in many communities. Those who still make it treasure the deep crimson reminder of resilience and shared history that once colored every celebration. She crab soup was a rich, velvety bisque tied closely to Gullah Geechee coastal traditions, made with fresh crab meat and the delicate roe from female crabs. The roe gave the soup a distinctive orange hue and depth of flavor that could not be replicated with substitutes. Simmered slowly with butter, cream, and a touch of sherry, it was a dish served for special occasions or to honor guests. Its origins trace back to Charleston kitchens, where African-American cooks perfected the technique, balancing sweetness from the crab with the savory cream base. Served piping hot, often with a sprinkle of fresh parsley, it was both a comfort and a luxury. Overfishing, rising costs, and changes in seafood sourcing have made authentic she crab soup rare, leaving it as a treasured memory for those who once knew the joy of its silky texture and briny, ocean-rich flavor. Charred sweet cornmeal cakes were the traveler's food, built for endurance, not pleasure. The batter of ground corn, salt, and water was poured thin and cooked until crisp and dark, intentionally over-roasted to make the cakes last longer without spoiling. They were tough, smoky, and dry, but when soaked in broth or water, they softened into hearty meals again. Portable and durable, they could be wrapped in cloth and carried for days. For those who worked long hours away from fire or kitchen, these cakes were essential fuel, simple, sturdy, and reliable. The char was not a flaw but a strategy, sealing in flavor and strength. Each cake told a story of discipline, of people who could not afford to waste a grain. The smell of roasted corn was familiar and grounding, a link between past and present laborers. Each bite was proof of cleverness, born from need, a reminder that even the humblest ingredients could sustain great endurance. These cakes may not have been festive or soft, but they were food that traveled with you through struggle and survival alike, feeding body and will across endless miles of hardship. Flavor and a silky custard that made every bite feel like sunshine. A simple filling of fresh lemon juice, sugar, eggs, and butter, baked into a single crust until the top developed a delicate golden sheen and the center set to a creamy, tangy perfection. The pie cooled to a gentle wobble that invited quick slicing and generous servings. Families loved how the dessert used basic ingredients yet delivered a sophisticated citrus punch, ideal for cutting through rich dinners or heavy holiday spreads. Lemon chess pie brought a welcome spark to church luncheons, family reunions, and Sunday suppers throughout the 1970s. Its zesty aroma filled kitchens with a hint of spring even in the heart of winter, offering comfort and brightness in equal measure. This pie proved that elegance could come from everyday staples, turning lemons and sugar into a memorable finale that refreshed the spirit and left guests asking for the recipe to share and cherish. Buttermilk pie wrapped simple pantry ingredients into a velvety custard.
If your family carried this tradition forward, drop the dish that held your kitchen together in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to hear where this food came from. And if there is a pot of collard greens on your stove right now, you already understand everything this story tried to say.